The atmosphere within the sacred, stone-walled chamber was saturated with an almost tangible sense of historical weight and hushed reverence, as if the very air itself had been stilled to pay homage to a legacy that had never truly faded from the public consciousness. This was a memorial meticulously designed to belong entirely to Diana, a sanctuary of pure remembrance where the complexities of current palace politics were supposed to be set aside in favor of a singular, collective focus on a woman who had fundamentally reshaped the image of the British monarchy. There was an unspoken agreement among the attendees that this hour would be devoid of the usual rivalries, the quiet jostling for position, and the competing voices that so often characterized royal gatherings. It was intended to be a rare moment of crystalline clarity and grief. However, in a heartbeat that seemed to echo with the jarring sound of a glass breaking in a cathedral, the entire emotional landscape of the ceremony underwent a radical and irreversible transformation. The music, which had been a gentle, mourning backdrop, seemed to falter as Camila chose to interrupt at the most exquisitely sensitive juncture of the proceedings, a move that sent a visible shockwave through the front rows. Catherine, standing at the precipice of a deeply personal tribute, found herself momentarily frozen by the audacity of the intervention, her composure tested in a way the world had rarely seen. Then, in a move that absolutely no one in that room could have predicted, she made a choice that defied centuries of ingrained habit and the rigid structures of the court. She deliberately and decisively rejected the established royal protocol in full, public view of the assembled guests and the watching eyes of history. This was not merely a minor slip of etiquette or a misunderstanding of the schedule. It was a profound and deeply personal line drawn in the sand, a declaration of intent that signaled a tectonic shift in the internal power dynamics of the royal family. Before we venture further into the labyrinthine implications of this confrontation and what it truly reveals about the future of the House of Windsor, please ensure you are subscribed to our channel so you do not miss a single update on this developing saga. Catherine took a moment to steady herself, her posture becoming even more regal as she felt the atmosphere in the room tighten and constrict around her like a physical force. Beside her, William stood as if carved from marble, his body rigid and his expression a mask of stony silence that betrayed a deep, roiling internal conflict. While Charles kept his gaze firmly fixed downward, his eyes tracing the lines of the memorial program as if searching for an escape from the unfolding tension. This program was far more than a mere itinerary or a list of speakers. It was the official, codified order of the day, a document that carried the immense burden of ensuring the tribute remained focused on Diana's memory, rather than the hierarchical rank of those currently living. It was the shield designed to protect a mother's legacy from the encroaching shadows of royal status, a promise to the family and the invited guests that this moment was about the woman they had lost, not the positions they now held. Every person in that room understood that even the slightest deviation from this agreed upon path risked transforming a communal act of grief into a display of institutional hierarchy, effectively erasing the humanity of the person they were there to honor. The tension reached its breaking point when Camila stepped forward with a sense of practiced authority, choosing the exact moment when Catherine was about to deliver the most vulnerable and intimate portion of her address to the gathering. Camila's move was calculated and expected to be final, as she clearly anticipated that her interruption would redirect the ceremonial flow without a hint of public argument, relying on the fact that royal protocol, the ancient, unyielding set of rules that governs every movement and breath within the monarchy, traditionally dictated that Catherine must yield to a more senior figure regardless of the context. However, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a new kind of energy as Catherine turned her gaze toward William. His face remained largely impassive to the casual observer, yet Catherine could see the flicker of suppressed agony in his eyes, a silent plea that told her everything she needed to know about the stakes of this moment. This was his mother's memorial, a rare and precious window of time dedicated to her spirit, and Catherine realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that surrendering this moment would be a betrayal of the man standing beside her, and an abandonment of the history he had trusted her to defend. As the silence began to stretch out, becoming heavy and suffocating, Camila stood waiting for the expected deference, her eyes fixed on Catherine in a gesture that demanded compliance. The queen consort's surprise began to morph into something sharper as the realization dawned on everyone present that the usual surrender was not forthcoming, making the open resistance feel like a thunderclap in the quiet room. Catherine did not falter. Instead, she placed her hand firmly on the polished wood of the lectern and deliberately returned the program to its original place, her voice remaining calm and steady as she stated with unmistakable finality that the order of Diana's remembrance would not be altered for any reason. There was no tremor in her voice, no defensive posture, and not a single word of apology for her defiance, and it was precisely this level of disciplined restraint that made her refusal land with such devastating force. Charles, the king and the ultimate arbiter of such matters, remained strangely paralyzed, continuing to study the program for several long, agonizing seconds while the entire assembly held its collective breath, waiting for him to exert his authority and correct the breach of etiquette. Yet, his continued silence acted as an inadvertent shield, granting Catherine the necessary psychological space to continue her tribute, leaving Camila to stand in the spotlight of her own failed intervention, knowing that her institutional rank had failed to move the woman standing before her. When Catherine finally met William's eyes, the connection between them was so profound that it felt as though they were the only two people in the room, suggesting that the roots of this public defiance had been planted long before they ever walked into the chapel. His silence was not a sign of confusion or a lack of support. It was a deep, visceral recognition of the battle being fought on his behalf, acknowledging that she had crossed a line of protocol, because he had already made it clear why that line was sacred. To truly grasp why Catherine was willing to risk her standing and face the potential wrath of the royal machinery, one must understand that the core issue was never about a simple disagreement between two women of rank. It was about the enduring power of Diana's memory and the way her absence still dictated the emotional weather of the royal family decades after her passing. Especially for William, whose quiet exterior hid memories that no amount of ceremonial pomp could ever truly bury. Catherine had spent years meticulously studying this history, learning the contours of her husband's grief long before she ever officially joined the monarchy. Just as Camila understood the complexities of her own role in that history, beneath the veneer of polished titles, the carefully practiced formal smiles, and the management of public appearances lay a profound emotional wound that royal protocol, for all its ancient power, had never been strong enough to fully heal. For William, this memorial was never just another entry in a crowded royal calendar or a series of speeches to be delivered to a respectful audience. It was a deeply personal confrontation with childhood loss and the heavy mantle of public grief that had followed him since his mother's death. He felt a lingering, protective responsibility to ensure that her memory was handled with the dignity it deserved, and Catherine had spent over a decade by his side learning to navigate the specific distinctions between royal duty and personal honor. As the Princess of Wales, a title that carries the immense weight of Diana's shadow, she was acutely aware that comparisons between her and her predecessor could be a source of public warmth or a catalyst for unbearable pressure. Before they had even entered the memorial, William had made his expectations known in a rare moment of private vulnerability, touching the edge of the program Catherine held, and whispering a plea that was more of a command. "Please don't let them change this." He didn't need to elaborate on the politics involved. She heard the desperation in his voice and understood that any change to the planned tribute would feel like a personal violation of his mother's memory, a procedural adjustment that would cut like a knife. Catherine had simply nodded, absorbing his grief and transforming it into a silent promise of protection that she intended to keep regardless of the cost. Camila, however, was carrying her own complex emotional burden into the ceremony. Well aware that Diana's memory would always be inextricably linked to the most difficult and criticized chapters of her own life as a royal, she understood better than anyone that within this specific gathering, the natural flow of public sympathy would never gravitate toward her, and she had spent the morning studying the order of service with a wary intensity, knowing that every word spoken in tribute could potentially reopen old wounds she had spent years trying to move past. Charles, sensing the volatile nature of the event, had made a private appeal for everyone to remain calm and dignified, but his request lacked the specific instructions needed if the order of service itself was challenged. Princess Anne, ever the sharp observer of palace dynamics, had noticed the brewing storm long before the first word was spoken. watching as Camila scrutinized the schedule and Catherine gripped her own copy with a quiet, determined strength. Anne, as the Princess Royal, knew that in the world of the monarchy, no gesture is truly casual, and both women were approaching the program not as a piece of paper, but as a battleground for their respective visions of authority and respect. Catherine's resolve was anchored in William's private plea, and that memory acted as her armor when the moment of conflict finally arrived, though the roots of the explosion had been set days earlier behind the closed doors of the palace. The actual confrontation did not spontaneously erupt at the lectern. It had its origins 5 days prior in a small, deceptively quiet palace sitting room where a minor disagreement over a 3-minute segment of the program escalated into a fundamental battle over the ownership of memory. Catherine had arrived at that meeting expecting a standard, administrative discussion about the memorial's flow, while Camila had entered with the expectation that her position as queen consort would mean her decisions would be accepted without question. By the time that private session ended, no voices had been raised and no traditional arguments had been had, yet a single sentence had been uttered that shifted the entire dynamic and made the public collision on the day of the memorial almost inevitable. Catherine had been adamant about keeping the original tribute focused on Diana's charitable legacy, as this was the specific vision William had approved and one that felt most authentic to his mother's true spirit. This was not a mere ceremonial detail to her, it was a rare opportunity for the sons to have their mother remembered on their own terms, free from the institutional sanitization that often accompanies royal events. Camila, viewing the event through a more institutional lens, had proposed moving the tribute to a later slot and replacing a portion of it with a broader statement about the continuity of the monarchy as a whole, arguing that the memorial should reflect the crown as much as the individual. The tension in that small room had reached a fever pitch when Camila calmly remarked that, "No one person owns remembrance," a statement that Catherine interpreted as a direct dismissal of a son's fundamental right to define his mother's legacy. To Catherine, this was no longer a debate about timing or the order of speakers. It felt like a cold, institutional erasure of the personal grief William still carried, and she responded by slowly closing her folder and removing her glasses, allowing a long silence to settle over the room. She thought of William and the weight he carried, and she realized that she could not allow his grief to be treated as something that could be rearranged or minimized for the sake of institutional comfort. She told Camila in no uncertain terms that Diana's sons held a unique, untouchable position in deciding how their mother should be honored, and she refused to treat their perspective as a variable that could be altered. Charles was briefed on this exchange later that day by palace staff, but he chose a path of non-intervention, hoping the disagreement would simply dissipate on its own rather than forcing him to side with one woman over the other. This royal silence, however, only created a vacuum that allowed both women to enter the memorial ceremony believing they still held the high ground, with Catherine convinced the program was set and Camila believing her rank gave her the final word on the day. When the moment finally came at the memorial and Camila moved to intervene, the entire ceremony seemed to stall in a state of suspended animation, with every traditional instinct of the court screaming for Catherine to step back. The fact that she chose to stand her ground was a revelation, representing the collapse of years of carefully maintained restraint into a singular, calm refusal that left the most disciplined institution in the country without a script to follow. Camila had turned to the presiding aide to demand the change, her voice carrying the expectation of immediate obedience, but the aide hesitated, caught between the queen consort's command and the reality of a live ceremony. Catherine saw this hesitation and realized that the appearance of unity she was expected to protect was being used as a weapon to silence William's tribute. She looked directly at Camila and said, "No, this is Diana's moment," her voice staying perfectly controlled even as she drew a definitive line that favored personal memory over royal rank. The shock on Camila's face was evident as she realized her authority was being openly challenged, and she tried to argue that the program must respect the crown, only for Catherine to respond that respecting the crown did not require the diminishment of a mother's memory. As the two women stood in a state of quiet, public conflict over the printed program, William's silent presence beside the lectern became the most powerful factor in the room, his stillness signaling a profound endorsement of Catherine's defiance. Charles, finally forced to engage, looked toward his son rather than his wife, searching for a signal in a moment where any decision he made would have lasting consequences for the family's internal harmony. William gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a tiny gesture that nevertheless spoke volumes. He was not going to ask Catherine to retreat, and he was fully prepared to let the protocol be shattered to protect the tribute. Anne, recognizing that the situation was on the verge of becoming a full-scale scandal, acted with her trademark pragmatism, signaling the aide to proceed with the original order without engaging in the debate herself. This allowed the ceremony to continue, but it meant that anyone wishing to stop the tribute now would have to cause a scene that would be impossible for the palace to explain away later. Catherine began her address, her composure masking the adrenaline and fear that must have been surging through her. While Camila was left to grapple with a public humiliation as the hierarchy she relied upon was ignored by the very family she was meant to lead. The focus of the entire room eventually shifted to Charles, because everyone understood that a royal family can only survive such deep emotional fractures if there is a clear understanding of where the ultimate authority rests. He was caught in a classic, agonizing royal dilemma. If he corrected Catherine, he would be publicly shaming his son at his own mother's memorial. But if he supported her, he would be undermining his own wife's status as queen consort. For a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the king remained silent, his mind clearly weighing the institutional costs against the personal ones, until he finally made a decision that carried more weight than any formal speech he had ever given. He looked at William and saw not a prince, but a wounded son, and he realized that this was one of those rare moments where the human truth of the situation had to outweigh the requirements of royal rank. Charles had the power to stop everything, but he knew that doing so would make his son's pain look like a secondary concern to the rigid rules of the court. With a slow, deliberate movement, Charles folded his copy of the program and placed it on his knee, before leaning forward to give a 4-word instruction to the master of ceremonies: continue as printed. These words, though spoken quietly, had the impact of a final judicial ruling, effectively ending the dispute and signaling to everyone in the room that Catherine's defiance was being sanctioned by the king. Camila heard the words and remained frozen, the reality sinking in that her husband had chosen to prioritize the emotional needs of his son and the tribute of his former wife over her own immediate authority. Charles had managed to avoid a loud, public rebuke of his wife, but his decision was an unmistakable shift in the palace power structure, one that Anne later noted was necessary to prevent Diana's memorial from becoming a permanent stain on the family's public image. Catherine finished the tribute with a grace that gave no hint of the battle she had just won, while Camila waited for the ceremony to conclude before making a swift, silent exit from the chapel, avoiding the traditional family regrouping. The aftermath of the memorial revealed just how much the king's choice had cost Camila, in terms of her perceived influence within the inner circle, as she retreated to a private room to process the humiliation away from the eyes of the staff and the family. She was left with the cold realization that her authority had failed her at the exact moment she expected it to be absolute, and the trembling of her hands as she removed her gloves betrayed the depth of her emotional distress. Outside, the atmosphere was one of hushed conversation, as guests realized they had witnessed a historic break from tradition, with Catherine receiving quiet thanks from a clearly moved William. The palace aides were already in a state of high alert, trying to figure out how to frame the day's events to the press without admitting that a major fracture had occurred within the family during such a sensitive event. When Charles eventually found Camila in the private room, the question she asked him was stripped of all royal pretense. "Did you know she would refuse me?" Her voice was filled with a sense of betrayal that went beyond the day's protocol, and Charles's admission that he had known about the tension but hoped it would disappear only deepened her sense of isolation. Charles tried to explain that the memorial could not be allowed to become a public struggle for authority, and that Diana's role as a mother to the future king had to take precedence over the current hierarchical rankings of the court. He understood that defending Camila in that moment would have required him to ignore the powerful emotional history that everyone in that room was acutely aware of, a history that he himself was a part of. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Catherine was processing her own fears. admitting to William that she had known the risks of her refusal from the second she kept her hand on the lectern. William's response was not one of simple gratitude. He told her that he would rather deal with any amount of palace fallout than have remained silent while his mother's memory was altered for the sake of institutional comfort. He wasn't thanking her for a political victory. He was acknowledging that she had protected a piece of his heart that he had feared losing to the machinery of the monarchy once again. In the quiet aftermath, away from the titles and the public gaze, the conflict was distilled down to its most human elements: a son's love for his mother and a wife's willingness to risk everything to protect her husband's peace. William explained to Catherine how difficult it had always been for him to reconcile the public version of Diana with the woman he knew as his mother, and how he felt that every royal ceremony was an attempt by the institution to reclaim her and reshape her into something convenient. He admitted that for a moment, he had feared the family would choose the path of least resistance and follow Camila's lead, and he had been prepared to step forward and cause an even greater scene if Catherine had moved aside. Catherine assured him that she could not stand by and watch him lose control of that tribute, and the relief William felt was visible as he reached across to take her hand, acknowledging that she had protected something he simply could not afford to lose. The impact of Charles's decision to let the ceremony continue as printed was profound, as it established a new precedent where royal authority was no longer seen as synonymous with the personal ownership of grief or memory. This understanding allowed the family to begin to move forward, but the world outside was already creating its own narrative based on a single, leaked photograph of the confrontation between Catherine and Camila. The image of the two women, one resolute at the lectern and the other frozen in interruption, became a global symbol of a monarchy struggling to balance its past with its future. Broadcasters and journalists seized on the moment, describing it as an unprecedented break from the deference that usually characterizes royal behavior, and no amount of palace spin could change the fact that the public saw a major shift in the family's internal power balance. Catherine found herself increasingly uncomfortable with the media's portrayal of the event as a personal triumph over Camila, as her intention had never been to humiliate or defeat anyone, but simply to protect the sanctity of the tribute. She told William that she hated the way the memorial had been turned into a contest with winners and losers, but William reminded her that the public would always attach its own meanings to such visible moments of defiance. Camila, too, was struggling with the power of that photograph, knowing that it would become a permanent part of her royal record, and would likely be used as evidence of her declining influence in the face of the next generation. The morning after the memorial, the headlines were dominated by Catherine's refusal to move, and the crowds gathering at Kensington Palace showed that the public had emotionally connected with her decision to prioritize family memory over courtly protocol. The final verdict on the day was far more consequential than any newspaper headline or television commentary, as it fundamentally altered how the monarchy would handle the legacy of Diana moving forward. Catherine had not set out to destroy protocol, but her actions had exposed its limitations, proving that while tradition can organize the structure of a monarchy, it cannot dictate the depths of human grief or the bonds of family loyalty. Charles took concrete steps in the following days to ensure that all future commemorations of Diana's personal legacy would be guided by her sons, a move that effectively separated her memory from the broader institutional management of the crown. Catherine received no formal reprimand for her actions, as the palace chose to treat the incident as a unique response to an exceptional set of circumstances, rather than a challenge to the overall system. In a final private conversation, Camila admitted to Charles that she had fundamentally misjudged the emotional requirements of the day, accepting that Diana's remembrance was a territory that could not be governed by the standard rules of royal engagement. Charles listened with a new understanding of the toll his dual roles as king and husband took on his personal life, realizing that the conflict had finally forced the family to confront a history they had spent years trying to avoid. William's only regret was that it had taken such a public confrontation for him to realize that he had to set boundaries around his mother's memory, and he thanked Catherine for giving him the strength to do so. Catherine later returned the original, unchanged program to William, who kept it as a quiet reminder of the day when the monarchy finally chose memory over ceremony, a choice that shocked the world but ultimately saved the heart of the family. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.